In the spring of 1867, on a hill outside the Mexican city of Querétaro, 3 men faced a firing squad at dawn. One of them was an Austrian archduke who had become an emperor. His name was Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph, and in just a few moments he would be dead, his body riddled with bullets. His dream of ruling Mexico shattered forever. But the gruesome death of Emperor Maximilian wasn't just about 3 men in a firing squad. It was the bloody climax of one of the most bizarre political experiments in history, a story that begins not in Mexico, but in the gilded palaces of Europe, where powerful men played games with entire nations as their chess pieces. This is the story of how a well-meaning Austrian archduke became the puppet emperor of a country that never wanted him, how he was abandoned by his allies, betrayed by his friends, and ultimately executed by his enemies. It's a tale of political ambition, international intrigue, and the brutal price of imperial delusion. By the time you understand how Maximilian ended up on that hill, staring down the barrels of those rifles, you'll see why his death sent shockwaves across the world and changed the course of history forever. Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph María was born into privilege on July 6, 1832, in the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. He was the younger brother of Franz Joseph, who would become Emperor of Austria, which meant Maximilian would always be the spare, never the heir. This shaped his entire life. While his older brother inherited an empire, Maximilian had to carve out his own path. He joined the Austrian Navy, rising to become its commander-in-chief, and later served as the Austrian viceroy of Lombardy-Venetia in northern Italy. But even there, his liberal ideas and attempts at reform clashed with the conservative Austrian establishment. By 1859, he had been removed from his position, leaving him restless, ambitious, and looking for a new opportunity to prove himself. That opportunity came from an unlikely source, thousands of miles away in Mexico. The country was in chaos. For decades after gaining independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico had been torn apart by civil wars, foreign invasions, and political instability. Conservative forces, who wanted to preserve the power of the Catholic Church and maintain traditional social hierarchies, had been fighting liberal reformers led by a determined Zapotec lawyer named Benito Juárez. Juárez and his liberals had won what was called the Reform War, implementing sweeping changes that stripped the Catholic Church of its vast landholdings and established religious freedom. The conservatives were furious, and many of them began looking abroad for help. Meanwhile, Mexico's finances were in ruins. The constant warfare had devastated the economy, and the country owed massive debts to European creditors. In 1861, President Juárez made a fateful decision. Facing bankruptcy, he suspended all payments on foreign debts for 2 years. This gave European powers, particularly France, the perfect excuse to intervene. But France's emperor, Napoleon III, nephew of the great Napoleon Bonaparte, had bigger dreams than just collecting debts. He wanted to recreate French glory and establish a new empire in the Americas. Napoleon III saw Mexico as the perfect opportunity. He would invade under the pretense of collecting debts, overthrow the Republican government of Juárez, and install a friendly monarchy that would serve French interests. But he needed the right person to be emperor, someone with royal blood who could give legitimacy to this new empire. The Mexican conservatives, desperate to regain power, had been shopping around European courts for a suitable candidate. They found their man in Maximilian. The proposal was tempting. Here was a chance for Maximilian to rule his own empire, to implement the liberal reforms he believed in, and to bring European civilization to what he saw as a backward nation. Napoleon III sweetened the deal with promises of French military support and financial backing. A delegation of Mexican conservatives traveled to Europe, presenting Maximilian with what they claimed was an invitation from the Mexican people to become their emperor. Of course, this was largely fabricated. The so-called invitation came from a rigged plebiscite conducted only in areas controlled by French forces, but Maximilian chose to believe it was genuine. There was one major obstacle. Franz Joseph, now Emperor of Austria, was deeply skeptical of the Mexican adventure. He refused to allow his brother to accept the crown while maintaining his rights to the Austrian succession. If Maximilian wanted to become Emperor of Mexico, he would have to renounce all claims to the Austrian throne forever. This was a devastating blow. It meant cutting all ties to his homeland, his family, and his heritage. But Maximilian was determined. On April 10, 1864, he signed the renunciation, burning his bridges behind him. The decision split his family. His wife, Charlotte of Belgium, whom the Mexicans would call Carlota, supported his ambition, but many others were horrified. Maximilian's mother, Archduchess Sophie, reportedly wept when she heard the news, as if she were attending her son's funeral. In a way, she was. The moment Maximilian signed that document, he ceased to be an Austrian archduke and became something else entirely. A man without a country, dependent entirely on the success of his Mexican venture. In May 1864, Maximilian and Carlota arrived in Mexico aboard the Austrian frigate Novara. Their reception was mixed at best. In some conservative strongholds, they were welcomed with elaborate ceremonies and celebrations. But in much of the country, they were seen as foreign invaders, puppets of the French army that had conquered Mexico through force of arms. The couple established their court at Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City, transforming the former military academy into an imperial palace. Maximilian threw himself into his new role with enthusiasm, learning Spanish, studying Mexican history, and developing ambitious plans for modernizing his new empire. But from the very beginning, his reign was built on quicksand. The French army that had put him in power was fighting a brutal guerrilla war against Republican forces loyal to Juárez, who had fled north but never surrendered. Maximilian controlled the major cities, but the countryside remained largely hostile. Worse, he began alienating his conservative supporters almost immediately. Instead of rolling back the liberal reforms they hated, Maximilian actually embraced many of them. He maintained religious freedom, refused to return confiscated church lands, and even retained some of Juárez's liberal laws. The conservatives were appalled. They had brought him to power to restore the old order, not to continue the reforms of their enemies. This left Maximilian in an impossible position. The liberals would never accept him because he was a foreign usurper imposed by French bayonets. The conservatives were turning against him because he wouldn't give them what they wanted. He was an emperor without a people, ruling a country that didn't want him, dependent entirely on French soldiers to keep him in power. Meanwhile, the international situation was shifting dramatically. The American Civil War had ended in 1865, and the United States was now free to turn its attention to the French violation of the Monroe Doctrine. The Americans began supplying weapons and support to Juárez's forces while putting diplomatic pressure on Napoleon III to withdraw his troops. At the same time, tensions were rising in Europe. Prussia was emerging as a major threat to French security, and Napoleon III could no longer afford to keep thousands of his best soldiers tied down in Mexico. By 1866, the French emperor had made his decision. He would withdraw his forces from Mexico, leaving Maximilian to fend for himself. When Maximilian learned of this betrayal, he was devastated. The man who had lured him to Mexico with promises of support was now abandoning him to his fate. Napoleon III even had the audacity to suggest that Maximilian should abdicate and return to Europe, as if he could simply walk away from the mess they had created together. But Maximilian refused to abandon his empire. Whether from pride, honor, or simple stubbornness, he declared that he would stay in Mexico and fight for his throne. It was a noble gesture, but it was also a death sentence. As the French troops marched toward the ports, Republican forces began closing in from all sides. The empire that had never been more than a French protectorate was about to collapse entirely. Carlota, seeing the writing on the wall, made a desperate journey to Europe in 1866 to plead for help. She met with Napoleon III in Paris, begging him to continue supporting her husband, but the French emperor was unmoved. She then traveled to Rome to appeal to Pope Pius IX, hoping that the Catholic Church might intervene on behalf of the Catholic Empire in Mexico. But the Pope, while sympathetic, had no armies to send. The strain of these failed missions, combined with the knowledge that her husband was doomed, shattered Carlotta's mind. She suffered a complete mental breakdown and would spend the rest of her long life, she lived until 1927, in madness, never fully understanding that her husband was dead. Back in Mexico, Maximilian was making his last stand. As Republican forces advanced on Mexico City, he retreated north to the city of Querétaro with the remnants of his imperial army. It was here, in this colonial city surrounded by hills, that the final act of his tragedy would unfold. The Republicans, led by General Mariano Escobedo, surrounded the city and began a siege that would last for months. Inside the city, conditions grew desperate. Food ran short, disease spread, and morale collapsed as it became clear that no relief was coming. The end came through betrayal. On the night of May 15, 1867, Colonel Miguel López, one of Maximilian's most trusted officers, opened the gates of the city to Republican forces. Whether he was bribed, threatened, or simply saw which way the wind was blowing, López's treachery sealed Maximilian's fate. Republican soldiers poured into the city, and by dawn, it was all over. Maximilian, along with his loyal generals Miguel Miramón and Tomás Mejía, was captured on a hill outside the city called Cerro de las Campanas, the Hill of the Bells. The man who had dreamed of ruling an empire was now a prisoner, facing almost certain death. The trial that followed was swift and brutal. Maximilian and his generals were charged with treason against the Mexican Republic and with violating the laws of war. The most damning evidence against Maximilian was his own decree, issued in 1865, which ordered the immediate execution of any captured Republican fighters. This so-called Black Decree had led to the deaths of thousands of Mexicans, and now it would be used to justify his own execution. The military court, meeting in the Teatro Iturbide in Querétaro, deliberated for just 1 day before reaching its verdict. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by firing squad. News of the verdict sparked an international outcry. European monarchs, intellectuals, writers, and politicians bombarded President Juárez with telegrams and letters pleading for clemency. Victor Hugo, the great French writer, wrote an impassioned appeal calling for mercy. Princess Salm, the American wife of a German prince who had served in Maximilian's army, threw herself at Juárez's feet, begging him to spare the emperor's life. But Juárez was unmoved. He had seen too much blood, too much suffering, too many of his countrymen die fighting against foreign intervention. In his view, executing Maximilian was not just justice, it was necessity. Now, what made this execution particularly gruesome wasn't just the firing squad itself, but the web of betrayal, international intrigue, and calculated brutality that led to that moment on the Hill of the Bells. The story becomes even more chilling when you realize that Maximilian's own decree would be the very law used to justify his death sentence. As French troops began their withdrawal in 1866, Maximilian found himself increasingly isolated. Napoleon III, facing pressure from Prussia in Europe and mounting costs in Mexico, had essentially abandoned his puppet emperor. The man who had promised military support and imperial glory was now cutting his losses, leaving Maximilian to face the Republican forces alone. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Despite explicit orders from Napoleon to abdicate and return to Europe, Maximilian refused. He felt bound by honor to the Mexican conservatives who had supported him, declaring he could not abandon his people. This decision, though perhaps noble, sealed his fate. Meanwhile, his wife Carlota had embarked on a desperate mission to Europe, pleading with Napoleon and even the Pope for continued support. Her efforts were not just unsuccessful, they were catastrophic for her mental health. The stress and repeated rejections triggered a complete psychological breakdown. She began showing signs of paranoia and delusion, convinced that people were trying to poison her. By the time she learned of Maximilian's capture, she was already lost to madness, spending the remaining 60 years of her life in mental institutions, often believing her husband was still alive and ruling Mexico. The siege of Querétaro in early 1867 was where Maximilian made his final stand. The city became a death trap as Republican forces under General Mariano Escobedo tightened their grip. For months, the imperial forces endured bombardment, starvation, and disease. Soldiers were reduced to eating cats, dogs, and eventually leather. The civilians trapped in the city suffered even worse, with reports of people dying in the streets from hunger and typhoid fever. Maximilian himself lost significant weight and developed a persistent cough that would plague him until his execution. But the most gruesome aspect of the siege was the betrayal that ended it. Colonel Miguel López, one of Maximilian's most trusted officers, had been secretly negotiating with the Republicans. On the night of May 15, 1867, López opened the convent of Santa Cruz Gate, allowing enemy forces to pour into the city. Some historians suggest López was motivated by a substantial bribe. Others claim he was blackmailed, but the result was the same. Maximilian awoke to find Republican soldiers surrounding his quarters. The emperor, who had trusted López with his life, had been sold out by the very man sworn to protect him. The capture itself was almost anticlimactic after months of siege warfare. Maximilian, along with his loyal generals Miguel Miramón and Tomás Mejía, was taken without a fight to the convent of Teresitas, which became their prison. The irony wasn't lost on observers that the would-be Emperor of Mexico was now confined in a cramped monastery cell, his imperial dreams reduced to straw bedding and barred windows. The military tribunal that followed was a masterpiece of legal theater designed to legitimize what was essentially a political execution. Held in the Teatro Iturbide, the trial lasted only 6 days, with the outcome predetermined. The prosecution focused heavily on Maximilian's Black Decree of October 3, 1865, which had ordered the immediate execution of any Republican fighters captured with weapons. This decree had led to thousands of deaths, turning what might have been prisoners of war into summary executions. Now, that same legal framework would be used against its author. Maximilian's defense team, led by lawyers Mariano Riva Palacio and Rafael Martínez de la Torre, argued that he was a legitimate head of state acting within his rights. They pointed out that similar harsh measures had been used by Republican forces, but President Juárez had already made his decision. The man who had spent years hiding in the mountains, governing Mexico from the back of a black carriage while dodging French and imperial forces, was not about to show mercy to the foreign prince who had usurped his nation. The international pressure for clemency was unprecedented. Princess Salm-Salm, the American wife of a Prussian prince who had served in Maximilian's army, personally pleaded with Juárez for the emperor's life. Victor Hugo, the famous French author, sent passionate telegrams arguing that executing Maximilian would stain Mexico's honor. Giuseppe Garibaldi, the Italian revolutionary hero, added his voice to the chorus for mercy. Even the United States government, which had supported Juárez throughout the conflict, quietly suggested that clemency might be wise. But Juárez understood something his international critics did not. Mexico had been invaded, occupied, and had a foreign ruler imposed upon it by European powers who viewed Latin American nations as their playground. Thousands of Mexicans had died fighting for their independence. To spare Maximilian would send the message that European princes could meddle in Mexican affairs with impunity, facing at worst deportation if their schemes failed. The execution had to happen to establish that Mexico was truly sovereign. The night before his execution, Maximilian displayed remarkable composure. He wrote letters to his family, distributed his few remaining possessions among his servants and guards, and spent time in prayer. He gave his signet ring to Dr. Samuel Bash, his personal physician, asking him to deliver it to his mother. To his barber, he gave his watch, saying the man had served him faithfully, even in captivity. These small acts of generosity in his final hours reveal a man trying to maintain dignity in the face of approaching death. On the morning of June 19, 1867, Maximilian rose at dawn and attended Mass in his cell. His last meal was simple, a cup of chocolate and a piece of bread. He dressed carefully in a black frock coat, black trousers, and a black sombrero. the irony being that he had finally adopted Mexican dress just hours before his death. At 6:30 a.m., the carriages arrived to transport the 3 condemned men to the Cerro de las Campanas. The execution site was a carefully chosen piece of political theater. The Hill of the Bells, so named for the bell-like sounds its rock formations made when struck, overlooked the city of Querétaro. 4,000 Republican soldiers formed a square around the execution ground, ensuring that this moment would be witnessed and remembered. The symbolism was powerful. The foreign emperor would die on Mexican soil, surrounded by Mexican soldiers, under Mexican law. As the 3 men stepped from their carriages, Maximilian's composure was remarkable. He embraced his 2 generals, telling them they would meet again in a better world. Then, in a gesture that shocked even his executioners, he approached each member of the firing squad and handed them a gold coin, asking only that they not shoot him in the face so his mother could recognize his body. This act of generosity toward the men about to kill him left many witnesses in tears. His final words, spoken in Spanish, were, "I forgive everyone, and I ask everyone to forgive me. May my blood which is about to be spilled be for the good of the country. Long live Mexico." He then placed his hands over his heart, indicating where the soldiers should aim. At 7 a.m. the order was given. The volley rang out across the hill, and Maximilian fell, struck by multiple bullets. But the gruesomeness didn't end with the execution itself. The embalming process that followed was botched, leaving Maximilian's corpse in a horrific state. The Mexican authorities, perhaps intentionally, did a poor job preserving the body, which was then put on public display. Photographs from this period show a corpse that barely resembled the once handsome Archduke. When Austrian officials finally retrieved the body months later, Emperor Franz Joseph was so horrified by his brother's appearance that he ordered the coffin permanently sealed. The aftermath was equally brutal for those left behind. Carlotta lived another 60 years in madness, never accepting her husband's death. She would spend hours preparing for his return, setting places at dinner tables and maintaining the fiction that she was still an empress. The Mexican conservatives who had supported Maximilian were systematically hunted down and executed or exiled. The dream of a Mexican monarchy died with its emperor on that hill in Querétaro. The execution of Maximilian sent shockwaves through European royal circles. Here was proof that the age of easy imperial adventures was ending. No longer could European powers simply install puppet rulers in distant lands without facing serious consequences. The gruesome fate of the Austrian Archduke served as a warning that would influence European foreign policy for generations. Perhaps most chilling of all was the calculated nature of the entire affair. From Napoleon's cynical abandonment of his puppet, to Lopez's betrayal for silver, to Juárez's cold political calculation that mercy would be seen as weakness, every step of Maximilian's path to execution was marked by betrayal and brutal pragmatism. The romantic notions of imperial glory and noble sacrifice were stripped away, revealing the harsh reality of international politics where even emperors could become expendable pawns. The Hill of the Bells, where Maximilian met his end, still stands today as a memorial to this dark chapter in Mexican history. A chapel built by his brother Franz Joseph marks the exact spot of the execution, while an obelisk commemorates the Republican victory. The morning of June 19, 1867 dawned clear and cool on the Hill of the Bells. At exactly 6:40 a.m., 3 volleys of rifle fire echoed across the Mexican countryside, and with them, the final chapter of European imperialism in the Americas was violently closed forever. But Maximilian's death represented far more than the execution of a failed emperor. His gruesome end served as a brutal lesson in the ruthless pragmatism of international politics. Napoleon III had promised military support, then abandoned his puppet when it became politically inconvenient. Conservative Mexican allies had pledged loyalty, then watched helplessly as their cause crumbled. Even trusted officers like Colonel Lopez had betrayed their emperor for Republican gold. The Hill of the Bells became more than an execution site. It transformed into a powerful symbol of Mexican sovereignty, a place where foreign intervention met its definitive end. The three bodies lying in the dust that morning represented the death of monarchical dreams in Mexico and the birth of an unshakable republican identity. For Europe's remaining monarchs, the news sent shockwaves through their palaces. If a Habsburg archduke could be executed by republican forces, no crown was truly safe in this new world order. The age of casual imperial adventures in the Americas was over, ended by the crack of Mexican rifles and the unwavering resolve of Benito Juárez. Maximilian's final words proved prophetic. His blood did help end the bloodshed in his adopted motherland, not through divine intervention, but through the harsh political calculus of deterrence. No European power would dare attempt such intervention again. Mexico had spoken with gunpowder and lead, and the world had listened. Today, visitors to the Hill of the Bells find monuments to both tragedy and triumph. A chapel marks where Maximilian fell, built by his grieving brother Franz Joseph. Nearby stands an obelisk celebrating Republican victory and Mexican independence. These competing memorials capture the complex legacy of that June morning when an Austrian archduke's imperial dreams died with him on Mexican soil. The gruesome death of Emperor Maximilian marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It proved that in the brutal arithmetic of power, noble intentions and aristocratic blood counted for nothing against the determined will of a people fighting for their freedom.